Dear friends in South Korea, I'm speaking from Germany. We are in a war between the culture of death and the culture of life. It is a war between Marxist atheists who want to establish equality and of believers in God who want to establish justice. Until the student revolution of 1968, monogamy was the standard of the once Christian culture. One man and one woman bonding in marriage to give life to children and bring them up in the shelter of belonging to their parents. Now, sexual morality has been turned upside down. Revolutions usually are an answer to the demands of suppressed and suffering people. But where are the masses who demand same-sex marriage, the freedom to change your sex at will, or the dissolution of parenthood by artificial reproduction? They do not exist. The sexual revolution is a top-down revolution brought about by the elites of power and money, who use small and smallest sexual minorities to wage war on the traditions that once supported the family of father, mother, and children. Discrimination means that someone incurs disadvantages in political, economic, social, and cultural life because of these differences. The opposite is true. In order not to discriminate, we must take these differences into account. Do we want women to fight with a weapon at the front line of a war? Do we want that two men or two women can marry and produce children by buying the missing genetic material? Do we want that women can grow a beard by taking hormones, give birth to a child, and say that they are the father? Do we want men to compete with women in sports? The word and the meaning of discrimination. The Latin word discrimen means distinction or difference. The person endowed with free will must distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, to handle this freedom in such a way as to succeed in his own life and not to bring harm to his fellow human beings. Christians do not force their morality on others, but they must be able to proclaim their faith, act in accordance with it, and educate their children accordingly. That is the content of the human right of freedom of religion, which is essential to democracy. Of course, the ultimate victory of any revolution is the transformation of the human being according to their ideology. That is why all revolutionaries set in motion, as soon as they have the power to do so, to transform the children. If the core of the present revolution is to overthrow any moral limitations of sexuality, children must be sexualized from the cradle all the way through kindergarten and school. It is the agenda of the United Nations, the European Union, and national governments of the West. To give you just one example, I remember the shock of people in South Korea and Taiwan when I showed them material for sex education in German textbooks. They couldn't believe that kindergarten children were encouraged to naked doctor plays and masturbation. Teach your children to masturbate from babyhood onwards. Teach them to accept homosexual and transgender lifestyles. Change the concept of family by introducing rainbow families in picture books. Destabilize their sexual identity as boy and girl. Train them to be experts of contraception before puberty. Make abortion an easy way out. Give them puberty-delaying hormones if they so wish, even though it will ruin their life. Numerous times, parents appealed to the European Court of Human Rights to be allowed to withdraw their children from this kind of indoctrination, but without success. A document called the Yogyakarta Principles maps out the LGBTIQ agenda in detail. a group of so-called renowned experts of human rights, with no official authorization, formulated these 29 principles and were allowed to present them in the Palais des Nations of the United Nations in Geneva. 10 years later, the Yogyakarta Plus 10 principles were added, quote, additional principles and state obligations on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics to complement the Yogyakarta principles. All these are new invented expressions which you just heard: sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, which have the purpose to change the value system on which our societies are founded. Many governments have endorsed these principles and committed themselves to their implementation. The judicial key to the enforcement of these principles is the introduction of sexual identity into anti-discrimination legislation. The principles demand that all countries of the world take measures to change their constitutions, laws, social institutions, police, military, healthcare, education, and their citizens' basic attitudes in order to enforce and legally compel acceptance and privileged status for homosexuality and any other non-heterosexual identities and behaviors.